This was supposed to be the decisive week for Brexit, but when, how, and possibly even whether the UK will leave the EU remains unclear. After stormy debate, a partial victory for Boris Johnson, a majority in Parliament approved his withdrawal deal in principle, but they voted down his timetable. Now the ball is in Brussels court. Will it agree to the extension reluctantly requested by the Prime Minister? Can Westminster seal a deal? And we have three Brexit watchers with us here on To The Point to help us penetrate the fog emanating from London. Derek Scully works for the Irish Times, and he says Boris Johnson and his Brexit brothers have paralyzed Europe for 3 years. Now their EU departure has become a deal or no deal game show. But it can always get worse, and it will. And it's a pleasure to welcome Jon Worth. He is a British blogger living here in Berlin. He says a general election before Christmas is now Boris Johnson's only way out of his self-inflicted Brexit mess. And we're very happy to have Vendeline from Bredow with us. She works for the British magazine The Economist, and she says MPs are kicking the can down the road, which means Brexit is less and less likely by the end of the month. So, Derek, you say that Johnson and his Brexit brothers, in your words, have paralyzed Europe. But aren't we, in fact, seeing at least a little bit of movement now? At least there has been agreement on a deal, which, in fact, is something Theresa May never achieved.
Yeah, there's been technically a preliminary agreement. I mean, it's tiny steps forward, but there could easily be more steps back. I mean, we've been doing this for a very long time. It's a signal of just how poisonous the British political system is now, that the Parliament doesn't trust its own Prime Minister. They don't trust him that they will agree to this and he'll double-cross them, or he will be double-crossed by his Brexiteers, the hard Brexiteers, and they will have a no-deal Brexit. So it's a sign of how bad things are that this is all they could do this week, and we don't know what's coming. So yes, it's progress if you want, but from a very low base.
So the parliamentarians, Vendeline, are asking for more influence, more details, more time. You say that amounts to kicking the can down the road, but isn't it pretty understandable that they have, let's say, woken up out of their stupor and are actually making some demands, given the magnitude of what's happening?
It's absolutely understandable because it's a very complex undertaking. They have to read through hundreds of pages or more than 100 pages of very detailed, very complex stuff. And you can't do that in a few days, even though the Prime Minister tried to get them to do that by the end of the month. So it is absolutely understandable. The only thing is, of course, if you do then ask for yet another extension, that again creates uncertainty and the possibility of further obstacles or problems, which is, of course, why Boris Johnson kept insisting, no, we have to leave by the 31st of October, which increasingly looks unlikely and unfeasible.
So, Jon, you say a general election could wind up being Boris Johnson's only way out. Explain that to us, if you would, because, in fact, he does have approval on this deal. Why would he want to reopen it, so to speak?
It's essentially because he only got approval because he put the parliamentarians, or potentially put the parliamentarians, under enormous time pressure. They didn't actually really know what was in this deal. So it's basically, give me this deal now. And what the parliamentarians have said is, hang on a minute, we need more time to analyse this. And when they start looking into it, they see details with regard to all of the different aspects, the economic relationship, the Northern Ireland border, where they have problems. And ultimately, that 330 politicians that Boris Johnson had backing his deal, that will whittle down. It will go lower and lower as the weeks go by. And Boris Johnson has understood that. So if he says, OK, let's risk a general election, I'll go into the general election promising Brexit and hopefully come back with a majority. So ultimately, it would be a gamble, but that way he might increase the number of Conservative members of Parliament and then be able to get a much larger majority to make sure that his Brexit is secure.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of an election in a moment, but first let us ourselves explore a little bit of what this deal does contain. So, as Jon just mentioned, Ireland, especially Northern Ireland, a major sticking point. The DUP party that used to be friends of the Tories is saying it's been sold out. Can you just briefly tell us, Derek, what exactly is the agreement now on Ireland Is it workable, and is it going to be acceptable in the end?
Yes, there was a compromise on both sides, and Northern Ireland in future will be sort of in between the EU and the UK. It will be officially legally part of the UK customs union, so if the UK does deals with the US, it can profit from that. But there's a back door, and that back door will keep the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which is staying in the EU, open. So basically, if you were to be positive about it, they have the best of all possible worlds. EU membership unofficially, pragmatically, on a day-to-day basis, travelling over and back across the open border, but they also will have access to these wonderful new global Britain trade deals that London will be agreeing. So they got the best of all possible worlds, but the people in Northern Ireland who are loyal to the Queen, they don't want special treatment. They just want to be as good UK citizens as anyone else. And they think that as time goes on and the trade differences between the UK and the EU get bigger, the gap between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK will become bigger. And then they will sort of on a slippery slope towards United Ireland, which they want to avoid.
Vendeline, let's talk a little bit about timing. As we said, Johnson had sworn he would leave the EU by October 31st, but now he's submitted this very, very ambivalent request to the EU for an extension. Take us through that, if you would.
Well, Boris Johnson said he'd rather die in a ditch than leave the EU later than October 31st. Now, he's not dead. He may be in a ditch, but he's not dead. What he did is something very unusual. He sent, because by law, by the Ben Act, he was required to ask for an extension. So he sent that letter demanding an extension, but without signing it and probably without putting a stamp on the letter and maybe even smudging the ink a little bit. And then he sent another letter, which he signed, where he says, well, you know, I'm actually against the extension, which was, of course, playing to his base. That was all part of his posturing. And, you know, he's a great theatrical theatre maker. So that's what it is. You know, he will need an extension. It's impossible to get it through by the end of the month. But because he promised he wouldn't do that, that's this whole charade of not signing the letter and pretending, you know, he's doing something he's obliged to do because his enemies imposed it on him.
So it seems the ball is now in Brussels court, and from what we're hearing, decision makers there are torn between frustration and the fervent desire to ensure an orderly withdrawal. Let's go now to DW's Brussels Bureau Chief, Max Hoffman. Hi, Max. Hope you can hear and see us. Can you tell me, first of all, what is the mood in Brussels? Are people there basically saying, we have just got to get this thing over?
Well, first of all, the mood is that the ball is not at all in the court of the European Union, but they still feel they need guidance by Boris Johnson. What's the plan? Because as you know, the Brexit deal is on ice. Even the withdrawal bill, which is the legislation behind that deal, is on ice at the moment. And Boris Johnson has always said, if there is an extension, then he will pull that bill and he will call for snap elections. So does he really want to do that? How much time would he need to do that? If not, if he still wants to pass that deal, how long will it take him to get it through the UK House of Commons, if at all? And the thinking here is, if we know how long he needs to do that, then we'll give him that and maybe 5 days extra, and then he'll have the time he needs. But so far, no signals like that from the UK, so there is frustration about that. And, you know, it's been going on for 3.5 years. It's no miracle that many here just want to get it over with, but with a deal.
So what's your guess where this is, how this is going to play out? When will we have a decision out of Brussels, and what kind of time frame do you think we'll then be talking about?
EU ambassadors met on Wednesday, and it appeared that in the room they were all in favor of an extension. The question is just how long. The French want a short technical extension, maybe even 3 to 4 weeks, and countries like Germany say give them the extension they asked for, which is until the 31st of January. They will meet again on Friday and might get a decision there. What they want to avoid at all costs is another summit, another Brexit summit that gives even more attention to Boris Johnson.
Max Hoffman, thank you very much for being with us. So let's pick up on that, Jon, and come back to this general election idea that you had mentioned in your opening statement. Now, Boris Johnson had said, if in fact it's a long extension, he will maybe want to go through with a general election. But apparently his party is very divided. So what's your assessment, first of all, on where the Tories stand, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Labour?
So basically, the Conservative Party thinks it could win a general election. It's 10 percentage points ahead of the Labour Party in the opinion polls. Boris Johnson is more popular than Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader. But the Conservatives are nervous because they were also 10 points ahead in the opinion polls back in 2017. And look at what happened there, because Jeremy Corbyn caught up then with Theresa May, the then Conservative leader. There's also the case that many Conservatives want to get Brexit done and say, let's get Brexit done first and then have a general election, because the population will then thank us for having managed to get Britain out of the European Union. Because there is that gentleman waiting in the wings, Nigel Farage, the very well-known member of the European Parliament, who will come roaring back. He will essentially say, this Brexit deal that Boris Johnson has negotiated, that's not a real Brexit. We want a real and radical Brexit, out and out now. And Boris Johnson fears that he would lose support to the Brexit Party, and that might allow opposition parties in. And so that's the reason for the nervousness. Winter is also coming, and no one really likes doing election campaigns in November and December when it's rainy and cold and unpleasant, and that might also mean that election turnout may also be down. So it would be a very, very strange election. But ultimately, on balance, I still think the Conservatives will go for that because they see the weakness of the Labour Party just now.
And where does Labour play out in all of this? We heard now that Jeremy Corbyn is saying, yes, he might want to go ahead with a general election. What would likely be the results for Labour?
I think it could be disastrous. He seems to be getting into the detail of Brexit. At this stage, nobody wants to hear any detail anymore. It's a binary decision. Brexit now, yes, no. And he's saying this deal that has been negotiated is worse than Theresa May's deal, that it would undermine workers' rights and so on. In the UK, because Britain might want to sort of undercut the rest of the European Union and become sort of a competitive Singapore on the Thames. But he's getting into detail. At the end of the day, do people trust Jeremy Corbyn? And I think the answer is really no. And there's been this terribly damaging thing about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. The Labour Party has been consuming itself. I mean, it almost doesn't need an opposition party like the Tories. It's fighting itself. I don't really know how attractive a proposition Labour is at the moment with this leader. But of course, that's for the British voters to decide.
But Labour by now has a relatively clear position. It says it wants a second EU referendum. It's taken Labour 3 years to come to a relatively clear position. So ultimately, if you want Britain to remain in the European Union, you can now relatively safely vote for either Labour or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens or the Scottish National Party, whichever might have the best chance in the constituency in which you live. So that might save them.
But a second referendum 2 years ago perhaps might have enthusiasm. At this stage, even friends of mine who want to stay in the European Union, they are saying get Brexit done, which is a classic Tory populist expression.
Clearly, the outcome of any vote would depend on public opinion. And as we're hearing, opinion in Britain is increasingly polarised. Let's hear the voices of some of those who went onto the streets just this past week to speak out.
I believe that the British people are the minority at the moment. We don't want that. We want to have the British people being the majority because we are British.
You're ashamed, mate.
I think it's a terrible deal for the country, and it's a terrible deal for the poorest people in the country.
As a Brexiteer, I'm disgusted with all the delays.
Boris wants to push through things in a way that we can't have a say on it, just to save his own face, basically. He wants to be the guy who got us out before the deadline. And it's not the way it works, because this is far too big to score political points, in my opinion.
The battle lines are drawn. But what does the majority in Britain want?
Let's get Vendeline to tell us that. What does the majority in Britain want? And given the level of polarisation that we see there, would a new election resolve anything at all?
Well, it would give Boris Johnson probably a firmer mandate, because remember, he's not elected. He's never been elected to the post of Prime Minister. And at the moment, the mood in the country seems to be that the majority are that he would get a majority if you held elections tomorrow. So he's, of course, keen on that because it would strengthen him and strengthen his hold on power.
And if he did get a majority, is there any chance that he would back out of this deal, that the European Research Group, the hardline Brexiteers, possibly would gain more influence that they could use to push through a kind of a no-deal solution? Is there any chance we'd see some kind of radical development like that?
I think that's unlikely because although it's not a good deal, Boris Johnson is afraid and he's worried about the chaos that could ensue with a no-deal Brexit. He's intelligent enough and pragmatic enough to know how dangerous it is, and they could have not quite a civil war, but I mean really chaotic scenes in Britain. So he's very keen to avoid that. And all this grandstanding and saying, rather die, and that all the stuff that he's been saying was just to apply more pressure in order to get a deal done. He always wanted an agreement. I'm quite certain of that.
Derek, we talked about the majority and what they want in Britain, but where do people in Scotland and Ireland stand? It has often been said that one of the terrible side effects of Brexit could be essentially breaking apart the United Kingdom. Do you think that is where we're heading? What are people in Ireland and Scotland saying now?
Yeah, well, people in Ireland were, there's no good Brexit, but of all the Brexit deals, this is fine. Can we just agree on this? What was just the current Brexit deal? Because the primary achievement of the Irish government in Dublin was no border, that the status quo from the last 20 years was preserved. But there's a big asterisk beside that, and that asterisk is that all this technical stuff of trade and collecting tariffs and in Northern Ireland, we actually don't know how trade will work on the British Isles in future. So there's a big if, will this actually work? And on the other hand, people in Ireland are wondering, eventually people in Northern Ireland will realise they've gotten quite a sweetheart deal if it works. But then the question is, why didn't the Scots get it? And you've already seen that it's coming out. And so the law of unintended consequences could be that we kept the border open between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But what happens if Scotland gets up some momentum? And this is like the steroids that the nationalists in Scotland have been needing to break away. So, we could have, saved Ireland and broken up the UK on our neighbour islands. So, who knows where it's going?
Next issue, Jon, there is a palpable longing for resolution. We heard Max saying that's the case in Brussels. We heard people in that film talking about their wish for resolution. Yet experts are saying that even if a Brexit deal goes through, let's say by the end of the year or early next year, there will still then be another chapter of wrangling, of uncertainty surrounding trade, because Britain will then have to very quickly negotiate new bilateral trade agreements with the EU, its biggest trading partner, and with its longed-for partner, the US. Is that process truly going to be as difficult and painful as what we've seen along the Brexit trail?
It will probably be even worse, although maybe it won't have quite the kind of public sort of debate. It's definitely going to be much more time-consuming and much more complex than what we've seen so far. And the idea should be that the framework for that deal should even be in place by the end of 2020, so just over 12 months from now, which is impossible to achieve. So ultimately, we might get over this deadline now, but we've got another deadline coming up in just over 12 months, which is going to have to probably itself be extended. And also, if we look at, for example, it took the European Union 7 years to negotiate a trade deal with Canada, and that was about much more minimal issues than Britain is going to have to negotiate a trade deal with the European Union. So we're going to be looking at something of upwards of 5 years to get everything sorted out for the trade deal between the UK and the European Union. If you're tired of Brexit, the best way is to stay. Essentially, hold a second referendum and stay, and then at least the sort of cliffhanger waiting for the next deadline will go away. If you actually go through with this now, this is only the first of a series of deadlines which are going to be coming up in the next few years. So maybe it won't be the topic of everyday discussion so much more, but this is going to be a nightmare for a decade for the UK if they do see this bit through.
Let's see whether either of your fellow guests think that could really still be an option. Referendum and backing away from Brexit at all? Vendeline, can you even imagine that could still be an option?
I agree with Derek. I think that is highly unlikely by now. I think there was a time, let's say a year ago, when there was a lot of momentum for a second referendum. us, the Economist, were in favour of that because we argued that the first time people really didn't know what they were voting on. So we thought with a heavy heart, because normally one obviously must respect the results of a referendum, we thought a second referendum is a good idea. But I think by now the time it's too late. So that window of opportunity has closed, and I think it's highly unlikely.
Derek, in a way, Jon's argument is premised on people voting on the basis of facts and projections, and the clear balance between costs and benefits of Brexit looks like it probably will be negative for Great Britain, to put it mildly. Yet that's really not what people are deciding on the basis of. Is it? Aren't we looking at something that has become, as we saw in the film, absolutely emotional?
I think it always was emotional. It's always been a very deep need. It's a struggle within the British soul. Who are we? Are we part of something bigger, or are we better off alone? And the detail is just distracting us. And you can really see it as you know, living in Ireland. We know the British quite well, probably better than other people in Europe because of our interesting history. But I find it really telling that nobody in Britain really, if any other country in Europe had held up a continent for 3 years, I think some people would be embarrassed, perhaps some people would be ashamed, some people might apologise. They feel that they can do this for another 3 years, perhaps. And I don't know if the rest of Europe is really interested. There will be more extensions and talk of extension, the patience and so on. But this notion that they'd even be wanted in the European Union at this stage, nobody in Britain seems to be asking that question. It's one thing to say we'd like to stay. Does anyone else really want them at this stage? Because if they stay, there will be effectively a political civil war in the country. They will not be very productive European Union members.
But on the other side, if they go at the current moment, bearing in mind that there is a majority of the British population that wants to remain. We saw more than 1 million people on the streets of London just a week ago arguing the case for Remain in the European Union and for holding a second referendum.
60 million not.
No, yeah, I know, but you're not going to get 1 million leavers going out demonstrating, and there's never been that kind of groundswell of support. You've got the biggest grassroots pro-EU movement of any European country is in the UK just now. Too late, you might argue. But bear in mind, however, there is no deal that you can get through the current House of Commons because there is no majority for anything. The only majority there is for anything is against no deal. And so ultimately, what's your way of unlocking all of this? You've tried unlocking it through parliamentary means over the last 3 years. That's ultimately failed. A new election may unlock it, but again, as we've discussed, it may not. So ultimately, the solution, if you really can bear with it, is essentially to say a new election, Remain parties try to manage to organise as best they can to try to at least deny the Conservatives a majority, and then you move forward to a second referendum some point in the middle of 2020, because it might not be nice for the European Union, but it's definitely the least worst outcome.
This assumes we didn't have the detail back then, and the whole premise of a second referendum is if people knew the detail, they will vote differently. People are not going to read the details. Exactly. Ireland is the country of referendum. People go and vote on referendums on European treaties. When we ask them what they're voting on, they haven't read anything. Right. So we're assuming people will now that they have the detail, will willingly make themselves more informed than before. But we've had 3 or 4 years of poison. They're just going to vote with their gut like they did the last time.
And if they vote with their gut, at the moment, based on the current opinion polls, they will vote to Remain.
But very tightly, and then we're back to the start.
Right, but the other alternative, putting Britain out with an inadequate deal and with all of the tensions that we've discussed about Ireland, is also a bad solution. So ultimately, you've got to choose the least worst solution here. And the least worst solution remains an election followed by a referendum.
So, Vendeline, let me get you to weigh in here, and I'm going to come back to our title because I'm going to ask all of you to answer that title question. Can Westminster seal a deal is the title question. Jon, in a way, is saying no. Where do you stand? And if you say yes, when and what's it going to look like?
Oh, gosh, that's to the point. Yes, I think Westminster can strike a deal, and it's not going to be a good deal. It's not going to be pretty, but I think we are now maybe on the way of doing that. When is the big question? I think the most likely deadline now is the 31st of January. They are going to ask for an extension, and then it's the 31st of January. But I mean, with a big question mark. But that, at the moment, I think is the most likely timetable. So my answer is yes, it can strike a deal, and the most likely deadline is the 31st of January.
Derek?
Unfortunately, it breaks my heart to say it, but the European Union has more important things now to discuss than Britain, and Britain's problems need to be solved in Britain. So I say with a heavy heart, go with God, but go.
And when? When will it happen?
It's possible, because then we can get back to what's really important, the European Union's future in the world, trying to battle between populists, trying to battle what's our security issue, what are our migration policies, what kind of Europe do we want. Britain has been distracting us for long enough.
And in other words, you're saying Westminster will seal the deal and you say farewell.
You might want to apologise for wasting your time for 3 years, but I don't really expect that apology.
We've gotten a lot of good talk shows out of it, haven't we? Jon, last word to you. Are you saying Westminster won't seal a deal?
Westminster won't. This composition of the House of Commons won't seal a deal. It needs a general election. After the general election, either you get this deal because Boris Johnson is strengthened, or alternatively, Britain is on a track to a second referendum.
OK. Thanks very much to all of you. We'll see whose prediction comes true. And thanks to you out there for joining in. See you again on To The Point.